Okay, so good evening from Indonesia, and for those of you who are joining us from elsewhere in the world, good morning and good afternoon as well. Welcome back to day 2 of the AIFIS-SSRC academic writing workshop. My name is Piankani, and I will be your moderator for the day. And I'm replacing Firman from yesterday. And as I was here as well last year, so it's really nice, first of all, to see you again, for Lerny and for Kratoska, who will be the speakers for today's sessions. We have 3 sessions planned for today. The first will be a continuation from yesterday, as Paul Lerny presents part 2 of planning and drafting strategies for research papers. In the second session today, Paul Kratoska will speak to us about the ethics of scholarly communication. And finally, last but not least, Paul Kratoska will also discuss the differences between dissertation writing and academic publication in the third and final session of the day, entitled Why Your Dissertation is Not a Book. So everyone, for all the participants, as yesterday, we asked that you please feel free to post questions throughout the presentation by typing them into the chat box of the webinar, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, I believe, next to the raise hand function. And also, if you are joining us through our YouTube, you can type your sorry, not chat box. Please forgive me. Let me repeat again. So you can type them into the Q&A function. Sorry, not the chat box. So the Q&A function. It's next to the raise hand. I believe in the right of your next to the raise hand function once again. And if you are joining us through our YouTube, then you can type your questions on the chat box right there on the YouTube. And we will address your questions for a short period of time at the end of each presentation, as well as a longer period of Q&A session at the end of the event today. And another information is we also have an FAQ, or frequently asked questions, from each session. So you might want to check that out because your questions might have been answered there. Okay, so once again, thank you all for your continued participation in the SSRC AIFIS academic writing workshop. And without further ado, I would like to welcome Paul Lerny to begin his presentation on part 2 of planning and drafting strategies for research papers. Paul Lerny, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Piankani. And very, very nice to see you again after a year's absence. Okay, so let me begin by sharing my screen with all of you. So, and there we go. Okay. Well, last night, as you know, we were taking a look at research paper introductions, and I mentioned that they were rhetorically complex, and went on to describe what that would actually entail. And I suggested some various things that you can do to be able to handle that rhetorical complexity, and yet at the same time make your introduction comprehensible to people. So that's what we're looking at tonight. I'd like to pretty much do the same thing with the with midsection arguments, as I mentioned at the beginning of last night's presentation. Midsection arguments are essentially the most difficult thing that writers report in the research that it's very, very hard to do these things. They find writing midsection arguments the most difficult thing to do, followed by the introduction, and then there's actually a distant third, which is the conclusion. But for the most part, people don't feel they have, research writers feel they don't have problems writing other sections of the research paper, but they do have problems with the introduction and with the argument. And with the argument, that's because it's ideationally complex. What you're trying to do with your arguments is demonstrate how various aspects of your research topic are related to each other, and how these relationships, which typically you're looking at for the first time in your own paper, change your research community's understanding of the research topic. So tonight we'll be doing pretty much the same thing as we were doing last night, and we'll be looking at tasks that you can perform to manage the ideational complexity of the paper, so you're not getting lost yourself, and at the same time you're making your arguments comprehensible to people. So let's begin. So last night, as I was saying, we were looking at the introductions, and you can see a picture here that we are looking at. The rhetorical complexity comes from the fact that you've got a rather short section of the paper, the introduction, but in that short section, you're trying to do basically four things. You're trying to frame your paper as important. You're trying to frame the paper as significant. You're trying to frame the paper as new, and you're trying to frame the paper as something with arguable ideas. And as we were looking at last night, the trick of this thing is to take core information and core information for the introduction. In other words, information that makes an introduction read like an introduction as opposed to another part of the paper, right? So we were looking at ways of taking the statement of the research topic and embedding it into a literature review to get that notion of importance. And you can see the question that you're trying to answer there on the screen. And at the same time, the research gap, and taking the statement of the research gap and embedding that into the literature review to frame the paper as significant. And once again, you can see the question that that's trying to answer. Very, very important to the research gap, of course, is the notion of the research question, a question of analysis, which usually begins with how something is so, or how something happens, or why something is so, why something happens. So you're taking that gap and you're embedding it into the literature review. And also a research answer, which basically says, my paper is presenting something new. More specifically, it's presenting a new understanding of the topic that has emerged from my research results. And finally, we were looking at the organizational forecast, which basically frames the paper as having arguable ideas. And we saw last night with that, because this is almost kind of a pickup point for tonight's talk. We saw that basically you'd be taking the arguments that you're going to make in the midsections of the paper, and you summarize them, focusing on the claims that you're making. In other words, you're saying, in the first instance, if you're a serious reader of my paper, you have to, there are certain aspects there are certain things about the relationships that I'm telling you that you should not take at face value. If I cannot give you reasons for why these relationships exist, you should actually just throw my paper away. In effect, that's what you're actually really saying, okay? So what we were looking at was the idea of taking those claims that you're making about what you have found and how this changes your research community's current understanding of the topic. And you are basically saying, if I cannot show you that these claims have a basis in reason and that I can illustrate them through evidence, then you shouldn't take my paper seriously, okay? And that's really kind of what's at stake here. So that's where we left off last night. So the focus of the talk today is midsection arguments, and the first, as we saw last night, for the IA article, we have basically a title, abstract, introduction. Sometimes there's a background and theoretical foundations section in there. Sometimes there's not. But then the midsection arguments fill up most of the paper, followed by a conclusion, followed by references. On the other hand, if you chose to write the paper around an IMRD organizational framework, then you get something a little bit different. The midsection arguments turn up elsewhere. So as you can see here, we have the title, abstract, introduction, very similar to the IA article. Once again, an optional background, theoretical foundations, methods, results, discussion. Discussion is where the arguments, where the midsection arguments turn up here, and conclusions followed by references. Okay, so that's what we're going to be focusing on tonight. Okay. So when we take, we were previewing this, when we take a look at midsection arguments, once again, there is core information. I've already mentioned this, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but there are claims, there are reasons, and there are evidence. Okay, so 3 types of core information there, and they have 2 rhetorical functions. The first thing is that you're presenting arguments as explanations. In other words, you're organizing core information to explain how your research findings lead to the readers, lead your research community to a new understanding of the topic. Okay, so that's the first thing, and that's actually when you come right down to it, and you look at research articles, the vast bulk of argumentation that goes on is really actually about explanation. There is a problem with the term argumentation because I think a lot of us in school, especially perhaps in high school and later on as undergraduates in college or university, we get the idea that argument is basically an intellectual fight. In other words, there's got to be a winner and there's got to be a loser. There's a long history to why that's taught. Argumentation is taught in high school like that, and as well as an undergraduate in college. But to make a long story short, what happens is that people take political argumentation and also legal argumentation, and they use that kind of as their model. In other words, it's an adversarial process by which people try to, well, in the courts, you try to prove someone's guilty or not guilty, and in politics, it's follow my policies or not, as the case may be. So you have that kind of thing. So there's always kind of a winner and loser kind of thing. But argumentation in the academe is different. What it actually really involves when we're talking about explanation is you take the work of other people, previous work of other people, and you begin to build on that. You don't try to knock that down. Now, I know we can, I'm a theoretical linguist, and I mean, there are some very, very famous people in linguistics who just go after each other. It's quite amazing. I mean, if it wasn't so painful, it would be almost entertaining. And if it wasn't such a waste of time, it would also be entertaining as well. That you get people with huge egos, and they have to kind of knock each other down. But for most of us, I think most of us realize that that's not what we do as a community. As a community, what we're really doing is we're taking the work of other people and we're building on that. We're building on that work, leading off to different directions. But nevertheless, there's always this respect for what has gone before. I mean, and so that's one of the things that happens. I know one of the problems that we find with people in our workshops, and for the last 7 years that the 4 of us have been working together on this, is that oftentimes people feel they don't want to argue. They don't want to argue. They will describe. They'll lay things out, but and they try to deal a lot with data, but they don't really want to argue the data. They don't want to explain things because they feel that it's too forward. That again, this kind of winner and loser kind of dynamic that goes on in political and legal argumentation. But actually, we don't do that. We don't do that as professional researchers. We build on each other's work, and we're respectful of each other. It is true. I mean, if something is descriptively inadequate or explanatorily inadequate, we normally try to fix it. We don't try to destroy it. Okay, so we have that. Then we do have argumentation as justification, and what we're doing here is we're organizing this core information you can see on the screen to explain why one understanding of the research topic is preferable to other understandings. But although we're doing that, although we may say that this particular explanation or this particular interpretation is preferable, we're not saying the other guy is wrong. We're just saying there are reasons to prefer this particular understanding as others. And once again, it tends to stay respectful. It may be very pointed, it may be very direct to the point, but it's always respectful. So tonight, when we look at kind of my examples, the text that we were working with last night, Yasmin Ortiga's paper, which I'm using here, you'll see that she does a very, very good job of at one point making a point and making that point clear, but at the same time generally being very respectful of what other researchers have said. Okay, so we'll be looking at that. Okay, well, just to orient you towards things, I'd like to take a look at the midsection arguments in our example text. So as we saw last night, she provides an abstract. She provides a good title here: "A Flexible University, Neoliberal Education, and the Global Production of Migrant Labor." So very, very clear. She's put into that title all the key ideas that she needs. She's calling it a flexible university. The universities aren't flexible usually. Paul Petrosky was warning against being cute in titles. This is not really cute. I mean, it's in one sense, but she's playing with words as well, because universities aren't usually flexible. So that raises a question almost immediately in readers' minds. So, flexible university, what are you talking about? And of course she says, well, what I'm talking about is neoliberal education and the global production of migrant labor. So of course, when people say flexibility, neoliberal education, and its connection, its relationship with global production of migrant labor, I don't see the connections there, but she's saying there is a connection. I wonder what's going to happen. I wonder what's going to happen. Oh, wait, let me think. And then the reader starts to put those ideas, starts to look at the relationship between those ideas. The idea of a university being flexible, it's a metaphor, of course. Universities aren't really flexible. It's a metaphor, and yet somehow the metaphor is built by the whole notion of neoliberal education and this idea of global production of labor and migrant labor. So she's trying to draw her readers in to start to look at the relationships between things, relationships that connections that may not be obvious. In fact, if you come right down to it about relationships, we never see a relationship actually. What we really see is we see things, we see ideas about things, but we don't see the relationships between them. They remain unspoken actually until they're actually pointed out, and that's the whole point really of a research article, to point out, basically to say the unsaid, right? If I can put it that way. Okay? So she's got a nice little title there that starts to get readers, I think, involved in what she's talking about. And then, of course, she does have an introduction. We saw last night this rather odd feature, but it works, of having basically two background and theoretical foundation sections. You don't usually get that going on, but she did that. Although she has an AI organizational framework, she did something you don't normally see. She actually added a methods section where she wants to explain how she collects and how she analyzes data. So she did that as well. Then she gets to her midsection arguments, and we have three right here, actually, that you can see. The main argument is the flexible university working within the migrant labor commodity chain. You can see the wording there. The wording in that title is reflecting the main title as well. Something you might want to. I'm not going to talk about titling today, but think about that. Think about this. You have certain key ideas, and you keep repeating them through the text, and you see the titles repeating those key ideas. And then, of course, he has flexible university, flexible faculty, flexible space. And so, in each case, she offers she's using this metaphor. So you're saying, well, how does being flexible have to do with working within the migrant labor community chain? How's that working out? Well, our faculty flexible. That's kind of an odd thing to say, but it apparently has something to do with being recruited in a very, very quick way, and then presumably retrenched. You lose your job in a quick way as well. So how does that all add up to flexibility? So again, creating questions in the mind. And flexible spaces, once again, restructuring space and displacing something. What are we talking about here? There's some kind of, she's indicating there are relationships between these things, but she hasn't identified them, she hasn't explained them, and if necessary, she hasn't justified them yet. But what she's doing is she's drawing in her readers. Okay, and of course she has a conclusion as she should, and references as she should. So let's take a look at this midsection arguments now. Okay. The first thing that you really need to do is to decide what actually needs to be argued in the midsections. When you come right down to it, I mean, when you did your research project, out of which your paper is emerging, you've got a lot of data, and even after you analyze that data and you basically shrink it down to a set of research findings, you've got a lot of research findings there in the paper. So some things to think about here before you begin to plan and draft your midsection arguments. First of all, be sure that you have collected enough data to develop the midsection arguments that change or maintain your research community's understanding of the topic. You've got to make sure that you have enough data. Sometimes with people in the workshop, we've run into a case where they've come into the workshop. Frankly, they're still collecting the data, but they're trying to write the paper at the same time, and that's really hard to do. Really hard to do. So the reason why I put this up here is, make sure that you've collected enough data. Now, I must admit, for myself, sometimes I'm in the middle of collecting data, but I just start to get ideas about maybe how this data can, even before I've analyzed it, I just start to get ideas about how the data can be analyzed and what finding I might come up with. And so I start writing things out. And if you do that, that's fine. It's just kind of a little concept paper to yourself type of thing that you do. So there's no problem doing that, but you don't really want to start seriously planning and drafting the actual argument until you have collected enough data. The other thing is, of course, you need to make sure that you have analyzed your data into research findings that identify relationships that connect different aspects of your topic that you're researching. Okay. Now, why these two concerns? Why are we looking at this? Research findings typically describe, explain, and also try to interpret 9 kinds of relationships. There are other kinds of relationships, but these 9 relationships are probably the most frequent. Okay, and they have to do with frequency, type, magnitude. These are things that describe relationships that connect things that we can see. So it's basically external behaviors and external characteristics. Okay. They feed into something else though, because oftentimes we do start to ask questions like, well, why are we getting certain kinds of frequency? Why are we getting certain kinds of magnitude? Why are we getting certain kinds of type? By the way, I hope everybody, you took my advice and you read that handout that I gave you from last night. It's at the end of the it's at the end of the slides for the first part, huh? Because I'm not I don't really want to go into defining these terms, operationally defining these terms. If you didn't read it, you didn't have time to read it, just make sure that you do so after I finish the talk, okay? Make sure you go back and you take a look at those things, because you will be able to follow this lecture if you didn't do that, if you didn't study that handout, but it makes things a little bit easier if you do, okay? Okay, anyways, so when you start to develop findings of frequency, type, and magnitude, these do lead to questions like, why are we getting certain frequencies? Why are we getting certain type of question variation? We seem to have the same thing or similar things, but they do vary from each other, and yet they seem to be the same thing or very similar things. In other words, they form a group. So why are we getting that? Magnitude, why do we get the spread of certain behaviors or the spread of certain characteristics in various ways? Why is that? Why does that happen? How does that happen? And so we begin to look at what typically we call structure and process. In other words, these are internal behaviors, they're internal characteristics, things that we can't necessarily observe readily, but we try to figure that out. And of course, once you start to infer how something is structured, how the different components that create a system, so that it's able to do certain things that no part of the system can do, and that you see processes, they operate in very, very specific ways so they can be integrated with each other. When we see that, that begins to lead to other questions that, well, exactly why has this thing, why has this structure, why have these processes come into being in the first place? In fact, how did that happen? So we have cause or we have consequences. What happens when different structures and processes come together? What are the consequences of that, and so forth? And then, of course, because most of us are involved in the social sciences here, we are looking at human agency. How do human beings affect causality? How do they affect consequence? How do they affect structure and process, frequency, type, magnitude? How does all this happen? So what oftentimes happens now, so that's basically what we're looking at, right? So and these are the kinds of relationships we're looking at. Now, if you've had a research project of any complexity whatsoever, after you've collected data and after you've analyzed it, your analysis probably yielded more findings than you can successfully argue in a research paper of 5,000 to 10,000 words. It's not possible. It's not possible for you to do that. And again, this leads us to an observation, okay, which frequently happens, that we find that we have a lot of people who are trying to take all their research findings and they're trying to in the first place describe them, and then they're trying to explain them. They're trying to interpret them, in a paper. But what happens is the paper begins to lose focus quite seriously. So, what is it you can really do about this? Well, I'm going to give you an example from our illustrative article right here. So, Yasmin did not really check out frequency or type or magnitude. She's using a lot of qualitative data that she gathered through interviews and observation as well. But what she was able to find out, she was able from those interviews, what people were saying, faculty members, university owners, students as well. From what they were saying, she was able to put together. She was able to see a system. There was a system that began to emerge, a system with components that began to emerge, its structure. It wasn't like a physical structure, but it was basically a conceptual structure that began to explain or that began to connect certain things, ideas of neoliberal managerial practices and the way that these have been applied to universities. And they do actually follow certain very definite processes. And in doing that, she began to look at, well, why has that happened? You know, what are the causes of this? What's been going on? What are the consequences for universities, for students, for faculty? And why have people decided to do certain things in the way that they have done? Now, despite the fact that she has all the information, and I know she has this information because I talked to her about this actually I talked to her about this when her paper was not yet published, but it was actually a conference paper that she was presenting, and I happened to be working with some of the people, not her, but with some of the people in that conference who were presenting papers. And so, anyways, but I ran into her actually after the conference because I was just struck by the paper, and I started asking about certain things. What happened is that she said, "Well, okay, I gathered information. Okay, I gathered information and analyzed it on causal kinds of things. But what I found was that most of these causes have been extensively discussed by previous papers. So, as a result, if she tried to put that into her midsection arguments, what she's doing is she's trying to argue what has already been argued. That's the problem. What she needed to be focused on was something, relationships that have not been identified yet, that have not been described and have not been explained or interpreted. That's what she needed to do. But she said, yeah, cause is important. I mean, it's really important. But what I decided to do is I decided to put this information about why universities find neoliberal managerial practices so attractive to and apply these things to the universities. I mean, that's what she's trying to do. On the other hand, the same thing with consequences. Now, as she began to basically analyze her data and actually talk to more and more people about this, and then she analyzed it again, and so she began to find that there were some very definite structures in place that nobody was talking about, and there were very definite processes that were in place that were really conflicting with a traditional way of looking at the university as a place where people come to both learn about something. Okay, in other words, they gain knowledge about certain things, and at the same time they start to learn at least the fundamentals of how to produce knowledge. In other words, as we all do, basically, what universities do really, really well is they really show people how to identify things that are not making sense, and then how to go about putting sense into the world, more or less. I mean, generally, at the very, very least, for undergraduate students, we're trying to get them to value the idea that they have an ability to be able to identify things that don't make sense, really don't make sense, but are really blocking them and their communities and other people from actually being able to meet their needs adequately. So, yeah, and that's a very kind of traditional idea. But the neoliberal notion of the whole thing was, actually, students are consumers. They're there to consume social capital and economic capital so they can go out and get good jobs. And if universities aren't doing this, they actually don't deserve to exist. That's kind of the whole neoliberal project, I guess you could call it. And this has been taken into the university. So, of course, there are certain consequences about that. Interestingly, she does talk about the consequences, but she waits until the concluding section. She doesn't argue them. So I said, gosh, why not? And she said, well, look, I'm only dealing, okay, this was basically maybe a small to medium size case study. I had 90 people that I talked to, university administrators, university owners. In the Philippines, many universities are private and they are owned by companies or they're owned by wealthy families, okay? And so, I talked to 90 people, the owners, the administrators, students, and faculty members, and to get an idea. And I could see what the effects of this neoliberal perspective on the university was. And she said, it is in many ways problematic. And we're not, as I was talking about, knowledge-based problems. That's your research problem I was talking about yesterday. These are real world problems that have real effects on people and so forth. She said, but with 90 people, there's no way that I could actually argue that and at the same time really be able to sustain it. It would be basically opinion. At the very, very least, it would make a weak argument that a lot of people could basically, could contest. And I have no comeback with that because I don't actually have data I don't have enough data to do that. Nevertheless, I felt I could actually say, this is something, these are seeming consequences that we can talk about. We need to do more research on this, but that's where it belonged. It belonged in the concluding section. It did not belong into the argument. So even though she had research findings on this, she did not really argue them. She used it for the conclusion instead. Human agency. Now that was an interesting thing because obviously, you've seen the people she was talking to. They were university owners, they were university administrators, they were university faculty and students, right? Okay, and when you start to look at what the owners and the administrators are doing to basically their faculty and to their programs and to the quality of education they're providing their students, it's very, very problematic. She could have, if she wished to, tear into those people, and say, university owners, university administrators, there's a special place in hell for you people for what you have done. You are going to pay for this. She could have done that. Look what you've done to these poor faculty members that you hire and then you just throw them out when you're done with them, And look at these students. You go in there, you promise them programs so they can get jobs overseas, and what happens? You don't teach them anything because the programs you developed have been done so hastily that nobody's given any thought to it, and they're cruddy programs. So the students do not get any social capital. They do not get any economic capital. They're worse off than if they'd gone to university. Now, you could do that, but notice what's happening with that argument. We're no longer really talking about a knowledge-based problem. In other words, there's something we don't understand about this situation. There are certain structures that are in place in the university, but they're invisible. We don't really see them. There are certain processes that flow from those structures, but we're not really seeing them. Nobody's really looked at these things yet. If you remember, we were talking about the gap, research gap yesterday, and that's the point that she's making. We haven't seen the structures, we haven't seen the processes yet. And so it's very, very difficult to really be able to talk about, well, why do people, what are the causes, what makes university owners and administrators attracted to basically screwing their faculty and their students? Why would that even make sense to them? You can't even start to answer that question. And you can't really ascertain to any degree of accuracy the consequences that this, personal and professional consequences this has for faculty and for students. You really actually can't do it. So she holds back. And in any case, what she would have done was she would have ceased to have been a researcher and she would have become an advocate. Advocacy social advocacy, it's oftentimes very important. And I know many of us, we get into research because we actually see real world problems that are egregious and need to be fixed. And we realize, well, before we can fix them, we really have to find out things. But then we get so involved in things, we start to slide over. And again, I think for many of the people whose papers run into problems in our workshops, this becomes one of the problems where they become so involved in the real world problem that they're investigating because it's not very well understood, that they slide over and they begin to make arguments for which they actually don't have a whole lot of, they don't have a lot of good findings for that. It doesn't mean you can't talk about these things, but you put them in different parts of the paper. That's essentially what I'm saying here, okay? So anyways, so how do you start to construct your midsection? So how do you start to construct midsection arguments from your research findings? Well, I would plan out what each of your midsection arguments will be about. Then, as we've just seen right here, you word a title for each argument so that it describes how the aspects of your topic are related. And we've seen this already, and I've talked about these things. These things are more suggestive, okay? Now, the titles are more suggestive than they are actually pointing things out. But what they do is the three titles here begin to set up a need for the argument. In other words, you're saying flexible university, we don't understand, that's a metaphor, we don't understand what that's really about, but it has something to do with working within the migrant labor commodity chain, okay? So what she's doing in this title, she said, I promise to make the connection between the idea of flexibility, the university, and somehow that it's all tied together by the idea of universities working within the migrant labor commodity chain. And I will show you how that works. If I don't succeed in doing that, then my paper fails. And likewise, it's the same thing with the other two things. Where if you, well, we'll see how the relationships, the invisible relationships work out here in just a second. Okay. So when we look at this right here, we can see what she's actually done. If you notice let's just go back to that for a sec. You see that in each case of these section titles here, there's a main title, the flexible university, for example, and then there's a subtitle, working within the migrant labor commodity chain, right? And the same thing for the other two titles, right? So what she's done here, when you start to look at this, is you won't really, if you're a reader, of course, and you just read the title, you won't really realize this at first, but when you start to read the argument, you can see what she's into. So the flexible university, whatever that is, it's a smaller system that's working within a much larger system. And you can see the wording of the title, right? It's saying working within the migrant labor commodity chain. So the migrant labor commodity chain is a much, much larger system, and the university is a smaller system. But being a system, the system is made up of parts, I said, of parts that are integrated together. And one very important part, I'm sorry, let me just go back. The idea of flexible university, I think, is probably quite complex. What your husband decided to do was, he said, out of all the things I could talk about here, and there certainly are a lot of things to talk about when you talk about a flexible university and how it's affected by neoliberal principles of management. But if you really want to understand this, in the first instance, look at what happens to the faculty and look at what happens to the space within the university, the physical spaces within the university. Then you're going to get at least an outline of what's going on, and then you can handle the other aspects of what a flexible university is. Okay, so that was the decision she made. I think she probably made a pretty good decision because she got the paper published. In other words, she convinced editors that, yeah, the first thing that needs to be talked about, nobody's talked about the flexible university yet, but if you're going to talk about this, the first thing you need to talk about the faculty and what happens to them, and also space, the learning space in the university and what happens to that. And then you can handle the other stuff if you wish to write other papers or get other people to write other papers, right? So that's what she does. So the flexible faculty then becomes a part of a flexible university. And of course, when she talks about rapid recruitment and retrenchment, she's saying there's a process by which faculty members are made flexible. And that has something to do with being recruited immediately. It's rapid recruitment. There's a large recruitment of new faculty that come in. They're thrown into programs that don't yet exist, and they're expected to somehow develop them. And usually because the university is trying to save money, they hire people who are yet the new, inexperienced faculty members. They don't really have a snowball's chance in hell of being able to do the job that they've been given. And that's the point that she's making. And of course, once the programs are trying to develop to meet rising student demand for these things, once these things peak and begin to become less popular, then the faculty members are simply fired. Okay, they let go. So that's basically what she argues there. And the same thing with flexible space here. They have these rapidly developed programs, but the facilities in which students are supposed to learn, for a lot of these programs that involve actual laboratories and such, they basically have no space to put the laboratories, so they squeeze them together. It turns out pretty messy. They don't have enough classrooms, so the students are all squeezed together, etc. And this is what becomes flexible. Okay, so that's what she argues there. What I'd like to do though is, for our purposes, to kind of take a look at something you can do here. Once again, if you haven't done this already, please study the description of the 9 commonly researched relationships in handout 3. I'm sure it's actually handout 2. I decided to combine it into the slides from last night. Okay, but it's called 9 commonly researched relationships. Then, what I want you to do with your own paper is, I want you to compare the characteristics of each relationship in handout 2, not 3. Sorry, I made a change at the last minute. With the characteristics described by your own research findings. This is basically what you're doing is you're discovering what it is that you can actually argue. And you can make decisions about, well, I could argue this, but maybe I might not argue it. Maybe I'll do something else with that. Okay, as we saw Yasmin doing with her thing. So the first thing you need to do is you need to take the characteristics in the handout and you need to match them against your own research findings. Okay, so you can make a decision. Then you construct section titles that identify the relationships that must be argued to lead readers to a new understanding of your research topic. Now, as you can see, those titles are more suggestive than they are actual identifications, though. So you need to be kind of aware of that. Okay. But at least now you know what it is that you've decided to argue. Okay. Now let's just take a look at constructing midsection arguments. Okay. So as I say, we have core information. So the first thing you have is a bridge. Now you can see I've put the parentheses around bridge. In other words, it's an optional feature. I like to really sort of see these things. I like to see them in there because what's happening is when you use the bridge, you're helping your reader to look at what you want them to look at. You're not trying to control their minds or anything, but there are certain things that you want them to look at. And so, for example, you may have a bridge that reviews the main point or main points of previous sections. And so you plan out what each of your section arguments will be. You draft the title for the argument that describes how the aspect of the section is related. Then you basically also have bridges that will preview the main point or main points of the next sections coming up. So your bridges work in 2 different ways. Sometimes you may be referring back to the things that you had before. In other words, you're kind of like summarizing what was said before and really focusing on those main points so that your readers can see how the argument that's coming up next fits into that previous information. Oops, sorry. Okay, why are we having this? Okay, this is strange. Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
You got it. Okay. Try to unshare the result.
Yeah, okay, no
problem.
Yeah, okay, no, that's it. That's all right. So anyways, constructing bridges and claims anyway, let's take a look at that. Okay. So anyways, bridges, they are optional, but I think it's really a good idea to put them in. Okay. So you're clearly stating or implying whether the argument is changing or maintaining the current understanding of the topic that's held by your research community. Okay. So that's the first thing you're going to do. Then you have claims. Now claims do two things. The first thing they do is they identify new, hitherto unexplained relationships between aspects of the research topic. So it's something kind of specific. One thing they may or may not do, but once again, I like it when I see this happen because it just helps readers follow the argument. Okay, you clearly state or imply the identified relationships are contestable, and they do require clear reasons based on and illustrated by evidence developed by research findings. In other words, you're telling your reader, I don't expect you to believe what I'm saying unless I can actually show you clear reasons and evidence for this happening, as I was mentioning before. So this happens in the claims. Okay, let's take a look at the way that Yasmin Ortega handled this. So once again, the title of her first argument is the flexible university working within the migrant labor commodity chain. We talked about the suggestiveness of this title. Now she's got to start really talking about it. So the first thing she does, she actually goes back to something that she's working on in the theoretical foundations and backgrounds section that she had. So a very short summary using one of her sources to do this. Both public and academic discourse attribute Philippine tertiary enrollment trends to students' decision-making behavior, familiar pressure, and a dominant culture of migration that portrays overseas work as an ideal life goal. Here comes where she says, however, I find that, what she's saying that I find it, okay? She's basically saying, this is the way I interpret it. My claim is an interpretation, and therefore it has to be argued. She does it in this little phrase. Now, oftentimes we don't notice this when we're reading, but think about building these kinds of things into your own arguments when you're doing this. So what is the claim in fact? Philippine colleges and universities also contribute to the expansion of popular programs in their own efforts to respond to the wants of student consumers and their future foreign employers. Okay, so what she's saying is and notice what I was talking about before when I was saying she was talking about respect. She said, look, previous research has showed that the reason why we get certain trends, certain patterns of enrollment, students going into one course as opposed to another course, it's because it has to do with their decision-making behavior and what their families think, and the idea that these kids desperately want to get out and work overseas where they can make more money. Okay, so that's what and she's not denying that, but she says Philippine colleges and universities also contribute. There's something else. There's something we haven't talked about yet. Okay, so people have talked about these other factors, but there's a factor, there's an aspect to this whole situation that we haven't talked about when we're looking at the expansion of popular programs. And let's see what she says. So one of the things that she needs to start to explain, her claim. So she starts off with reasons. Now, reasons, very simply, they summarize her research findings to show how the relationships identified by the claim manifest themselves in specific ways. Sometimes you'll also find them providing commentaries, that is, responses to understanding that challenge the factual accuracy of the writer's reasons. And we'll see that. Once again, everything is color-coded here, okay? And then finally, we have evidence, which illustrates these relationships, manifestations of themselves with specific instance, statistics, and expert testimony. Only 3 kinds of evidence, actually, generally speaking. And that's specific instance, statistics, and expert testimony. We'll see examples of specific instance and expert testimony. I'm not handling statistics here because it takes more time than the 1 hour I have, which I'm fast coming up on, so we should move along. Okay, so for this argument, she has basically 3 groups of evidence, of reasons and evidence that she puts together. And this is partly you need to kind of think about this because, I mean, oftentimes there'll be a group of reasons plus their evidence. There'll be multiple groups of reasons and evidence supporting the claim. It's not just usually one set, it's not just one reason and some evidence. It's more complex than that. I'll see what she's doing here. So she was saying here, private higher education institutes in particular seek to predict labor gaps. So what's really going on? Now she's starting to talk about the process, isn't she? She's starting to talk about the process that we were looking at before, this migrant labor commodity chain that she's talking about, okay? Seek to predict labor gaps in migrant destination countries and develop programs that would be appealing to aspiring migrants. In fact, most of the school administrators I interviewed shared that they monitor reports from the Philippine Overseas Employment Agency, noting possible job openings in places like the United States and Canada. As the popularity of a certain program grows, these institutions expand their student bodies accordingly. Now, at this point, she starts to make a comment here. Now, this is what the institutions argue. Arguing that they are merely addressing the demands of the market. At this point, she wants to point out something. There's descriptive inadequacy going on here, in her opinion, with regard to the institution's justification of expanding their student bodies. In other words, we're going to give these students what they want, basically. Okay, and that's what they're doing. So she said, well, since the students want this, what can we do? She says, yet in many ways, their definition of demand remains tied to a program's potential to bring tuition-paying students into the university. Okay, now she's really got herself into a pickle here because she's making this rather this rather contentious thing. These guys who say they're simply trying to address market demand. She's saying no, that's not accurate. So what does she need to do? At this point, she desperately needs some evidence to do this. So what does she choose? Does she choose a student? No. Does she choose faculty? No. She chooses a university president who says, so when I say there are popular majors, they are not necessarily the most in demand. They are just majors with the most enrollees. We have a major in fisheries, and these graduates are really in demand in local industry. But nobody wants to do fisheries. They would rather major in nursing. So administrators of these universities will offer these popular courses to get more enrollees, more income. So, I mean, basically, that's her evidence saying that anybody who, any university administrator or owner who says they're simply trying to meet the market demands, yes, yeah, but in many ways, that's not what's happening at all. Basically, the schools are doing this because they want to get money, and they're bringing in people, and nothing wrong with that exactly. But then we'll see there's going to be more of a problem there than meets the eye. Okay, now there's also a second group of reasons and evidence right here. So she goes on. You notice she by the way, Susan will be talking more about this, but she's paragraphing here. This is her second paragraph here, I might point out. Often, the opportunity to attract more students leads colleges and universities to offer trendy majors, even if such fields are not in the institution's area of responsibility. Okay, so there's basically a problem here. As such, reports of overseas labor gaps also spark sudden increases in the number of Philippine universities and establishing new programs in fields such as information technology, nursing, and marine engineering. Let's just go back to that right there. So basically, you can see there's a claim, and then basically it's just evidence. She just gives evidence here. The evidence. How do I know it's evidence? It comes from a previous piece of research. So you have expert testimony here going on. Maybe just to point out very quickly, when the university president, this is basically somebody. It's not expert testimony. The university president did not do any research as far as we can tell. Okay, there's no study noted here. Nevertheless, he is a witness. He is someone who's seen things and knows things. So that's the difference that I normally make between expert testimony and I think what I'm calling here is specific instance. So the university president gave us a specific instance, something that he knows about. He hasn't written about it. He hasn't done research on it. But when we talk about expert testimony, we're talking about somebody who does research as well. Okay, and so you keep that distinction in your mind. Okay, and then we have the third group of reasons and evidence. Yet, for every peak in student enrollment, Philippine colleges and universities also grapple with massive declines in demand. Okay, so how does that really work? So she says, labor demands in foreign countries can quickly disappear as quickly as they emerge, whether due to economic crisis, new immigration policies, or saturated labor markets. Once again, she basically takes his expert testimony on this. People have done research. Given such fluctuating trends, the school owners and administrators in my study refer to flexibility as the key to survival in the higher education market. In many ways, their definition of flexibility parallels the idea of global production, promoting the quick reallocation of resources and manpower to address changes in consumer demands. Okay, so and that's basically what she's saying. Now, she's as you can see here, she's got a reason. She doesn't have much evidence. So at this point, she puts in a bridge. The following two sections discuss two major strategies these institutions use to achieve such flexibility, maintaining a flexible faculty, you see that, and creating flexible spaces within the campus. And of course, she goes on to describe that. We won't look at those arguments. I think I've made the point and went over a little bit. But in conclusion, some essential takeaways to think about, okay? Organizing frameworks helps your reader to organize your lines of analysis and argument. But before you begin to draft your article, think about how you're going to argue, how you're going to organize the argument, okay? And why is this here? Okay, I think, I'm sorry, I remember that, sorry. I'm actually going back to part one. I want to put part one and part two basically all together here. I think I'm going to skip over that. I don't know why that went in there. The point that I actually want to make about the introductions is that you can't say everything about something. So in doing so, you have to choose. And we saw a good example here of Yasmin Ortega, where she decides that she wants to look at the flexible university. She sees it as part of a much, much larger thing. And then she begins to show the connections. The easiest way she can show the connections are by what happens to faculty and students, and then what happens to spaces within the university. And that sets up the possibility of discussing other factors that may come into being. And that's what you need to do. I mean, in planning and beginning to draft your arguments, what do you really want to argue? And I think that's the idea that I want to leave here. So once again, references, same as last night. And that's pretty much what I have to say. So thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing now. Return. Okay.
Okay, so I guess that concludes two parts of Paul Nerney's sessions talking about planning and drafting strategies for research papers. So once again, thank you, Paul Nerney, for a very helpful presentation for all the participants who are or are going to be in the process of planning and drafting their research papers, and that's of course including me. And I guess we will keep the questions to the end of the event today, since we will move on to the next session with Paul Kratoska. But before we move on to the second session today, we will have a 5 minutes break. So everyone, all the participants can take their break first for 5 minutes, and we'll be back again here at 8. Let's make it 8:15.
Okay.
How's that sound? Good.
Good.
Okay. All right. Okay. So before, it's a minute early, but I would like to remind a little bit for next session. So before we move on to the next session today with Mr. Paul Kratoska, allow me to remind all of the participants to please feel free to use the Q&A function to write your questions. You can find the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on the right side of the raise hand function. And you still can also post questions to Paul Nerney regarding the first session just now, since he'll stay around until the end of the event today. And if you are joining us through our YouTube, you can type your questions on the chat box there. So, and also please mention your name and institutional affiliation, so it's easier for us to monitor your questions. So I guess it's 8:15 already, and without further ado, I would like to welcome Paul Kratoska to begin his presentation about the ethics of scholarly communication. Paul Kratoska, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me share the screen here. And is everybody seeing what I hope you're seeing, which is a title page that says Scholarly Ethics?
Yes.
Okay, then we're on our way. Frankly, I find this presentation a little bit depressing, because I'd like to think that all of my colleagues and all of my students are ethical. And unfortunately, that's not always true. But what I'm going to talk about today has to do with ethical research, and then primarily ethical publishing. So ethical research. Sometimes when people are doing research, and this is true in the social sciences, it's obviously true in medicine, and probably in the law and other disciplines, sometimes your research will reveal personal information. And this information is something you have to use very carefully. Sometimes it has to be kept private, but at least if you're going to use it, you need to get the permission, the approval of the person who you got it from. So this is just standard practice for anyone doing research. And some of the disciplinary associations, the associations for anthropologists, for sociologists, medical researchers, have codes of conduct, which specify what you need to do with regard to personal information. These codes are sometimes very long and very detailed, but fundamentally, there's no mechanism for enforcement. If you violate the code and get caught, then of course there'll be consequences for you in your career. Some universities will have an ethics committee, and if you're doing research that requires use of this kind of sensitive material, the ethics committee may be there to be consulted and to give you approval. And some funding agencies also require ethics reports. Now, one of the questions that came in yesterday was from somebody who had submitted a paper, and the response from the editor of the journal was that they needed to have some kind of a certification about the ethics of the survey research that was done. And I honestly don't know how you set about doing that if your university doesn't have an ethics committee, because there really is no standard body or no central place where you can get this kind of certificate of approval. Anyway, let's move on to publishing. Now, there is a code of ethics for publishers, and most reputable journals and publishers will follow guidelines that are prepared by the Committee on Publication Ethics. If you want to have a look at that, just do a Google search on that, Committee on Publication Ethics. And it's really kind of boring. It's the kind of thing you might expect about fairness and transparency and so on. But they also talk sometimes about some of the unethical practices. And this is the depressing part, because I like to think that scholars wouldn't do these things. But the kind of thing that they're concerned with is the fabrication of data. people who just make up the information rather than actually collecting it. Sometimes there apparently is contact between an author and a peer reviewer. So if the author finds out who is reviewing an article, the author might contact that peer reviewer. And I mean, they might offer them a payment. They might just beg for them to help them. All of this is, of course, completely unethical. Then there's self-plagiarism, and that's basically where you've published an article and now you're trying to get another article out of the same material. And so you're using your material twice. Salami Publishing is a little bit similar. What you've done here is that somebody has done a piece of research and they have little bits of information. So they try to, instead of what they probably should do is to publish one article, they try to get maybe 2 or 3 or 5 articles by focusing just on one small bit of information. The idea of calling it Salami Publishing, if you go to a supermarket and they sell salami, you can get it cut very thin. In fact, so thin that you hold it up and you can look right through it. So Salami Publishing is articles that are very thin. Sometimes people have a conflict of interest and they don't make this known to the readers or to the journal. So again, that's unethical. It would also be unethical if an editor or the reviewer of an article were to ask an author to include a citation to their work in the author's piece of writing. Now, the value of that for the editor or the reviewer would be that they would get an extra citation. And of course, everybody is looking for impact. The more citations you get, the better. But it's certainly wrong for an author to ask for that sort of thing. Sometimes an author will submit an article to a journal. The journal will referee it. And then the author decides, well, I think I found a better place. So thank you very much, but I'm going to withdraw it. Again, this wastes the time and the effort of the journal that was sent to, and it's not acceptable. Of course, once in a while, somebody steals an entire article, just takes the article and republishes it. I don't have to tell you that that's wrong, but I will tell you a little story about that. When I was in graduate school, one of my professors told me about a fairly senior scholar. I won't mention the name except to say it was Dutch. It was a Dutch name. And my supervisor said what this man does sometimes is he would take an article written in Dutch. He would translate it, maybe change it a little bit, and publish it under his own name. And the reason he got by with it was that so few people read Dutch. So he usually didn't get caught. And finally, there's a question of dual submission. And that is where somebody says, okay, I'm going to send my article to 2 journals at the same time. And then whichever one takes it, well, that's where I'll go. This, again, is wasting time and effort on the part of the journal you send the pieces to. And what's likely to happen is that if I send an article out to a prospective reviewer, and that reviewer writes back and says, well, that's funny because I just got a request from another journal to review the same article. So at that point, what I'll do is contact the editor of the other journal, and there's a very strong likelihood that we'll both reject it. So these are some of the things people do that are unethical practices. Fundamentally, publishers watch out for unethical behavior on the part of an author, but we expect researchers to be ethical. And academic publishing fundamentally rests on the integrity of scholars. I mean, just think of it this way. An author is drawing on a body of data. They've done a lot of research, collected a lot of information. They can't put it all into a single article. So what they're going to do is give you a sample and say, I have 500 cases that I've drawn on. I'm going to tell you about 2 of them. But these two are very typical of all the other cases. Well, we have to trust you on that. And what's happening now in the sciences, and maybe a little bit in the social sciences, is that journals are offering authors a chance to put their data out for the public to see. So you publish an article in the journal, but you also have some place that you put the data. And that means that somebody can go and actually do the checking on this. But I don't think this is very common yet in the social sciences, and it may not become common. But anyway, trust is fundamental in academic writing and academic publishing. And because we rely so much on trust, when somebody is found not to be trustworthy, the response to that is usually very harsh. Somebody is caught plagiarizing, for example, and the reputation of that person is going to be badly damaged. Okay, well, let's talk about plagiarism. Usually when people think of plagiarism, they talk about using other people's words. So if you take somebody else's words, put them into your article, and don't acknowledge them as coming from someone else, that's plagiarism. And what you have to do, I think everyone knows this, but what you have to do if you are using someone else's words is that you indicate it is a quotation. And there are two ways you can do this. One is that you do a block quote. And you do this if you have more than, say, 4 or 5 lines. So you indent the whole thing. And that indicates to the editor and also to the readers that this material is quoted. And then you identify the source. Now, if it's a shorter quotation, you just put it inside quotation marks or inverted commas. Again, you identify the source. So it's very simple to avoid plagiarism if you just follow that style of putting material into your paper. There's a doctrine that's known as fair use. And this is the reason that you're able to quote other people's words in an article that you're going to publish. And the doctrine of fair use, which is usually written into copyright law, says that you can quote a passage if it's going into some use that is nonprofit, educational, not commercial. And of course, if you're publishing an academic journal, that's basically what it is. It's for educational purposes and generally speaking, not commercial. For fair use to apply, you have to identify the author and the source. But even then, a lot of editors will prefer that you limit the number of times you do use a direct quotation in an article. And the reason for this, I mean, they expect you to put it in your own words. And even then, if it's something that needs to be cited, you put a footnote. But the reason for this is that editors are concerned about legal difficulties. If somebody is using other people's words and in a way that might become a problem. Plagiarism is actually more than the theft of words. It can also be the theft of ideas. Now, there's certain information that's common knowledge. And if you are putting something in your paper that is widely known, of course, you don't need to give any citation for it. But factual details, information that is not common knowledge, will require a citation. Now, for example, I'm a historian, so I spend time in archives. And some of the material I find in the archives, it's not original with me, but it's something that I discovered and nobody else has been using this material. So I cite it, I mentioned the source. If you are going to cite the same thing, but I found it, you ought to give me credit for that. Then there are the explanations and interpretations. that you follow up your factual information with. Why did something happen? How did it happen? What are the implications? These are the contributions of an author. And if you're going to cite them, you do need to mention where you got that information. And if you're in doubt about whether a citation should be used or not, it's better to provide one. Now, self-plagiarism, as I said, is the reuse of your own material. If you are reusing something you have used before, you have to acknowledge the prior publication. And legally, it can be tricky because if you publish an article or a book, you have probably signed a publication agreement. And if you've done that, then you reuse the material again, you have violated that agreement. Now, generally speaking, okay, let's again take something that I do. I work on the Japanese occupation in Southeast Asia. And there's some certain basic information that I reuse over and over, which has to do with when the war began, the military action of the Japanese coming into the region, and so on. So I'm reusing the same thing. I'll try in each case to put it in a slightly different wording, but it's fundamentally the same material. That kind of thing really is not a problem, simply because what I'm really saying in the article is not about how the Japanese came, but some aspect of what happened during the occupation. So you wrote something. Do you own it? Well, first of all, there's something called work for hire. And if you're hired to write something or to collect data, then the person that hired you holds the rights. Now, in some cases, universities claim ownership of just about everything a faculty member creates. Not all universities do that. And the ones that do generally are mainly concerned with research in the sciences and find discoveries that might be something they can patent and possibly exploit to make money. Then there's what happens when you publish. Okay, if you publish a book or an article, as I said a bit earlier, you're going to be asked to sign a contract or at least some kind of an agreement. And whenever you do that, you transfer some rights to the journal or to the book publisher. Now, there are two ways this usually happens. Sometimes you're asked to transfer the copyright to whatever you've written. In other cases, what the publisher will ask is, they'll say, you keep the copyright, but give us the exclusive right to publish the material. So either way, you're signing an agreement that limits what you can do with the material that you have written. Now, what can you do in the way of getting some suggestions about a draft that you've written? Well, journals generally will allow you to place a draft of an article on a personal web page. And a lot of universities now have a repository. And again, it's usually quite all right to put a draft essay, a draft article on a university repository. In the sciences and a little bit in the social sciences and humanities, there are now things called preprint servers. And these are places that people send a draft of their article. Now, there is one in Indonesia, and I've given the reference to it here. But if you go to that preprint server, you're not going to find very much. But the idea of a preprint server is really, you can put a draft article out and get some feedback on it. Somebody may say, well, this isn't clear, or could you say more about this? It's something that people have always done in the pre-internet day. a lot of people would make a photocopy and send a photocopy of a draft of an article off to several friends and say, would you read this for me? Could you give me some suggestions? So this is simply the same kind of thing that people used to do, adapted to the electronic age. What most journals do not allow is uploading postprints. Now, a postprint, it's kind of an odd name because this is the manuscript in its final form. So if you've sent a manuscript to a journal and they've accepted it, then it will go through an editing process. And at some point, the journal will probably send the manuscript back to you and they'll say, okay, we have gone through this. Our copy editor has looked at it. They have made some changes. And so we're sending this back to you and we want you to look at it and let us know if the changes we've made are all right. So you will have the final version as it's going to go into the journal. That's the postprint. And very often a journal will say, okay, we're going to send the postprint to you, but we do not want you to post it on your personal web page or a university repository. Then there's the version of record. The version of record is the published version. It's the one that appears in the journal, and the difference between that and the postprint is that if it's in the journal, it will have page numbers that are assigned by the journal. It will be laid out by the journal. So everything put into final publishable form. And you may get a copy of that you're allowed to send around. I mean, again, what used to happen is that people got off prints, which is if you published an article in a journal, they might send you 20 or 25 copies. And you could send those off to your friends and say, oh, look what I did. I published this article in this journal. Or you could send it up to your head of department and you could say the same thing. Here's evidence that I'm being productive. So sometimes the journal will send around a PDF now, which is the final version. But what they're doing this for is to give you something that you can send to your friends. And again, it's preferable if you don't upload this to any kind of server. If you want to know what the policies are for any particular journal, you can go to this web page. And what this is going to do, it is just a list of journals, and it says, okay, this is what the journal is willing to let you do with your draft paper. And what about preprints? What about postprints? So to be safe about not violating a journal's principles, it's a good idea to check that. Now we come to copyright. And copyright's really kind of funny, because if you try to find out just how it works, and you just go do a Google search sometime, and you will find lawyers, publishers, all kinds of people saying, well, we don't really quite know what the rules are. Copyright's a very complicated thing, but fundamentally what it is, it establishes your legal right to your intellectual property. As a rule, copyright is automatically created when you write a work. And this means anything that you write. So if I write a grocery list, it says bread, milk, sugar, and somebody takes that grocery list and publishes it, and it's something that is identified in some way as something I've written, potentially it's a violation of copyright because I wrote that list. The bigger point about copyright, though, is that it turns your article into a commodity. It's basically saying, we have this piece of writing, 8,000 words. It's got this title, it's got this author. And because it's under copyright, you can transfer the copyright to someone else. And that's exactly what you do when you publish an article or you publish a book and the publisher asks for the copyright. How long does copyright last? Copyright rules are established by something called the Berne Convention. And under the Berne Convention, countries that sign it, most every country has, it's a minimum, copyright lasts for a minimum of 50 years after the death of the author. Now, many countries, including the United States, Britain, and Indonesia, have established a longer period. And so copyright lasts for 70 years after the death of the author. Now, there's another type of copyright that's been circulating now for maybe a couple of decades. It's an alternative to traditional copyright, and it's known as Creative Commons copyright. There's several variations of this. Some are quite liberal, and then you move on to something that's strict. And what I've done here is put the most free, and that's this one, and the most strict. So this is used for open access, or sorry, for online material. And so if you have a Creative Commons copyright, you can do what they call Creative Commons CC BY. And this material, other people can distribute it, they can remix it, they can tweak it, they can build upon it. They can even use it commercially, so long as they attribute it, so long as they give credit to the original author. Now, this is something that is quite important in the sciences, because frequently a discovery that somebody makes in the sciences is going to be used by other people who are going to build it into their own work, their own research. And so this kind of Creative Commons copyright, which lets other people remix it, tweak it, build upon it, is really quite significant for people working in the sciences. It doesn't work so well for the social sciences and humanities. And the reason for that is, when again, as I said, I'm a historian. The factual material that I use comes from archives. And other people can go to the same archive and they can find the same material. So my contribution, I mean, I did some work to find it, but my contribution really is how I analyze it, how I explain it, how I interpret it. And I don't want other people changing that, remixing it, tweaking it, building upon it, and then somehow putting my name on it, because I may very well not agree with what they've done with it. So for people in the humanities and social sciences, they often use this form, which is the most extreme version, the tightest controlled version of the Creative Commons copyrights. And under this one, others can download your work, they can share it with others, but they have to give credit to you. And they can't change this work in any way, or they cannot use it commercially. Another thing that's happening now is that people upload papers to academia.edu or to ResearchGate. And I mean, in many ways, this is very convenient. I'm sure you have, and I have also found something, and it's in academia.edu or ResearchGate, which means I can just download it. I don't have to go into my university library and try to get access to it that way. But it's important that you understand what these things are. Now, usually the edu means the website belongs to a university. That's not the case with academia.edu. If they were applying today, they would not be allowed to use that. But the standards when they registered this website were less strict than they are now. So they get to use the .edu. Both of these are commercial operations. They offer free access to material. So authors post material. And by doing that, it's quite possible that you're violating a publishing agreement that you've signed. And again, it's the same thing I mentioned before, that some publishing agreements will expect you to transfer copyright. And others will ask for an exclusive right to publish. So it becomes a violation of copyright if you upload the version of record to one of these sites. Now, if a journal is open access, it's a different matter, but if you're publishing in a conventional journal, and then you upload the article to Academia.edu or ResearchGate, potentially you're doing something illegal. Now, to be honest, very little is going to happen to you, probably nothing, but it is something that you want to watch out for. And here's the reason. This comes from the agreement that everybody signs when they sign up for Academia.edu. Now, this is one of these things that's several pages long, full of legal language, and people tend not to read it. But one of the things it says is that you grant to them, quote, a worldwide license to reproduce, prepare derivative works based upon, distribute, and otherwise use your member content. In other words, you're giving away rights to your material. A second point is, in this same agreement, that you assert that you own anything you upload and are not infringing intellectual property rights of others. Well, if you have given the copyright to a publisher, then this is not the case. You do not own it. You are infringing the intellectual property rights of the publisher. And third, you agree to indemnify Academia.edu if there is any legal action. Now, what that means is that if you have published something and then you've placed it on Academia.edu and your publisher sues them because material that's under copyright has been placed there, Academia.edu is going to say, well, that's nothing to do with us because the person who put it there told us that they had the right to do it. So if they didn't have the right to do it, then it's their problem, it's not our problem. And if Academia.edu is forced to pay some money, they will turn around and they will get that money from people who put material there. Now, as I said, there's very little likelihood that this is ever going to happen to you, but it is what is in that agreement. Okay, moving on. There is an operation called Sci Hub, and I almost hesitate even to talk about this because it's better that people don't know about it. Sci Hub offers free access to research papers and books online. They steal the papers. They do it by making agreements with some professors who are sympathetic to what they're doing. They make illegal copies and they put them onto their website. Sometimes when they do that, it compromises network security. It certainly violates copyright, and it threatens the very existence of academic publishers. The reason they get by with it is that this site is based in Kazakhstan. People have tried to take legal action against them. They've been sued many times, but it's just proved impossible to get any legal results when people try to take action against them. Then we come to predatory journals. Now, this only came into being once we started doing online publication, and particularly open access. Open access means that the articles are free to you as a reader, but it does cost some money to put out an open access article. And so how do you pay for that? Well, traditionally, what happens is that people subscribe to journals, libraries subscribe, or even individuals, and the amount that they pay covers the cost of preparing the journal. if the publication is going to be put out as open access, it's free to everybody. So there's a problem of getting the payment. And the solution to this for a lot of publishers is that they charge the author. They charge this way, have an article processing charge. Now, the hope is that the author will not pay it personally, but the author will be able to go to their university or to a government or to a foundation and raise the money that way. But in any case, to publish in an open access journal, you might be asked to pay this article processing charge. So naturally, what happens is that somebody out there has thought, well, look, if we set up a journal, maybe we can collect some money. So people set up these journals. They look like genuine scholarly journals. And the titles sound perfectly legitimate. The International Journal of blah, blah, blah. Some of them will claim that they're included in prestigious indexes. Often they're not, they're lying. They claim that they have high impact factors. Again, they're often lying, although some of them have created their own indexes and given themselves high impact factors. They claim that they have rigorous peer review. Generally, they're lying. They will publish your article so long as the processing charge is paid. And frequently they'll write to people and say, oh, I saw that you gave a paper at such and such conference. Well, I'm sure you'd like to get it published, and we can do that. And all you have to do is submit it, you pay the charge. By the way, if you have anything else, we can publish that too. And one of the clues is that you try to find out who's on the editorial board, you find out where their location is, and it's very hard to locate it. So I tell the story about one of these that somebody called to my attention, and the address that they gave, the physical location, was on Park Avenue in New York City. Now, Park Avenue is very expensive, and you wonder why would they be able to afford an office on Park Avenue. So I looked up that address, and sure enough, there was that address on Park Avenue. And what was there was a photocopying service that also offered mailboxes. So this journal had hired a mailbox on Park Avenue, and somebody presumably collected whatever mail came in there and sent it on. But it was just all a sham. So how do you avoid these things? Well, first of all, you look and find out if the journal is in the Directory of Open Access Publications. You look up the publisher and find out if it's a member of the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association. And be careful with that, because they also lie about that. They might very well say, oh, we're in these things, but they're not. Okay, then you can go to a website that's run by something called thinkchecksubmit.org. So there's the website. And this gives you lots of advice about how to identify predatory journals. Some years ago, a man named Jeffrey Beal set up what's called Beal's List. And he started listing predatory journals. And there are a lot of these things. He stopped the list several years ago because he was being threatened with lawsuits. But the original list is still online. There's some updating to it, but the list has more than 1,300 journals, which are just out there to try and get your money. Once you pay them, okay, they may publish a journal, they might not even publish anything. So it's really worthwhile to be careful about this. One other website you can turn to, there's a journal evaluation tool that was really set up for use in one university, but they made it publicly available. And so you can also go to this website and get some more information and have a way to check whether a journal that you're considering is legitimate or it's a predatory journal. Okay, all this is a little bit depressing, it's a little bit distressing, but that's the end of it. So thank you very much. I think we'll take a very short break now, and then I will talk a little bit about dissertations.
Okay, how about a 5-minute break?
That's fine.
Okay, then. So all the participants, we will have a 5-minute break. We'll be back at 9 o'clock.
Use the chat. Yeah, no, you got Joseph coming, so he's the only one who will see it. Yeah.
Okay, so welcome back everyone from your short break. There will be one last session for today. Will be presented by Polka Tosca again about why your dissertation is not a book. And afterwards, we will have the question and answer session. So please, if you still have questions, write it down on the question and answer function. And if you're from YouTube, you can always write it down in the chat box there. Okay, so Polka Tosca, you can proceed to the next session.
Okay. This is not a long session, so we have about 15 minutes left on the schedule, and I think that's about what this is going to take. So dissertations look like books. They are the right size. You've put a lot of effort into it. But honestly, they aren't books. They are advanced student exercises. They're written for professors who are familiar with most of the material, and that's the main people who read them. I wrote a dissertation. I gave a copy to my parents. I'm sure that they looked at the front where I said thank you to them. I don't think they ever got past the first page, and I don't think that's atypical. So it's an exercise, and the purpose of the exercise is to show that you have mastered certain things. One of those things is the literature on the subject. And this and then secondly, the theoretical literature. So there's the people who've written on that subject before, whatever theoretical literature you might be using. And so there'll be some section of the dissertation where you show, I have covered all this material. And thirdly, it demonstrates that you have the ability to do research and to write up some research findings. None of this makes a book. Most dissertations should not, and in fact, most dissertations do not become books. So let's consider some of the problems. If you're trying to get a topic for your dissertation, you're likely to talk to your supervisor, and the supervisor will say, well, you need to find something that hasn't been done before. I started off actually in European history. And one of the first things that we were told in graduate school was almost everything in European history has already been done. So you have to find some small little niche, some small little topic that hasn't been done. And then you can do research on that. Now, that probably can make a good dissertation because you're collecting some new information. But some small unresearched topic, it's probably been unresearched because nobody much cares about it. So it's fine for an exercise. It's not fine for making a book. You have an advantage in Southeast Asia because I realized once I moved out of European history and into Southeast Asian studies, European history you can think of as this great forest, and you're looking for some little clearing where you can grow your tree. Southeast Asia is kind of like this big plain with a few trees on it, but a lot of space where people can do things. So you have an advantage that way, but still, a dissertation is not going to be easily turned into a book. One of the things that happens is that dissertations, what you have discovered in your research is new pieces of information. And so in your dissertation, you say, all right, I discovered these facts. I discovered something that people hadn't understood before. A monograph, though, may or may not have some new facts, but they're addressing larger issues. They're addressing theoretical concerns. Well, there's various things that a monograph might do, but probably it's not going to be put together just to give you some fresh information. In addition, many dissertations are online, and anybody can find them and read them. And as a result, libraries have stopped buying books based on dissertations. And a bit of advice, if any of you are planning to publish a book based on your dissertation, it's smart not to say anything in the book manuscript about it being connected to a dissertation. If Professor so-and-so was your supervisor and has been really important in helping you get your manuscript put together, you certainly want to thank him. But you thank him by saying, I wish to thank Professor so-and-so for assistance in putting this manuscript together. You'd be wise not to say, I would like to thank Professor so-and-so who was my supervisor. The reason for this is that a lot of universities now are buying books through centralized distribution companies. And they will send a message to the company and they'll say, okay, we're looking this year for so many books in history, political science, sociology, so on and so forth, with these topics. Do not send us anything that is based on a dissertation. So when we've done things at NUS Press that were dissertation based, and we always make sure that the author has really revamped, revised the material and turned it into a book. But even then, if it is apparent to the buyers, to the university libraries, that it came from a dissertation, we're going to have trouble selling that book. Okay, so reputable publishers will rarely review dissertations. You need to be a little bit suspicious if somebody comes around and says, oh, I see you've done a dissertation, we can publish it, because there's a good chance that that publisher is a predatory publisher. Not always, and I know some people, one of my former students actually, and I was telling him, well, it's really very difficult to publish a dissertation. And he just looked at me and said, I published mine, and I published my MA thesis too. Well, yes, sometimes it happens, but you can't count on that. And in any case, for many universities, the rewards for publishing in a first tier academic journal is more than publishing a book. I've talked to people at universities who say, well, in my university, a book is equivalent to 2 articles in a very good journal, or 3 articles. Well, you put a lot more work into a book than you do into 3 articles. So these days, it actually often is going to make sense to think about what articles you can get out of your dissertation. So while some get published, most probably do have material for 2 or 3 articles. So if you're going to try it, if you want to turn your dissertation into a book, you will probably have to make a lot of changes. In fact, almost start over, because it will almost certainly require a new structure, a new research question, a different selection of information from what you put into the dissertation, a different style of writing, and you're writing for a different audience. Now, one reason this problem happens is that publishers lose money on most monographs, and they really can't afford to publish what is really a student exercise. Now, this point about losing money, we have another workshop coming up in the spring. I don't know exactly when yet, we haven't set the date, but that's going to be about getting published. And I'll have more to say about this side of things, about how publishing works and what you might need to do to get published during that workshop. Now, my understanding is that this will be completely separate, that people who've been through this workshop will be welcome to apply, but it'll be an open application. But to apply for that, you will need to have an article that is largely complete. But those of you who are not participants in that workshop will be able to tune in just as some of you are doing now. So how do you get publications from a dissertation? Well, somewhere in your research, you've probably come up with new information, and that's what you need to concentrate on. If you have a theory section, it's very unlikely that that says anything new, because in a dissertation, when you write about theory, you're showing to your professors, I have mastered these theories. I understand them, I can use them. There's nothing new about that, though. The literature search also is unlikely to say anything new. Again, you're doing the same thing. You're saying, I've read all these books, and I'm showing you here that I read them and that I understand them. So what you have that's new is your research findings. And as I said, that's likely to be factual information. One way that people try to get articles is they take a chapter from the dissertation. They say, okay, can I make this into an article? And sometimes you can. Sometimes what you really need to do is to come up with a new question. And I talked yesterday quite a bit about the kind of question that can be the core of an article. So you maybe just want to say, okay, my dissertation is based on my research. I've got other material that I put together when I was getting ready to write the dissertation. So just back up, look at the whole body of material that you have and think about what question you can answer. So you consider not just what's in the dissertation, but the material that you omitted from it. And you may well have to do some more research. Frequently, what happens when you're writing a dissertation is that you realize, well, here's a question I'd like to answer, but I can't because I don't have all the material I need. Okay, what I'm going to show you now comes from a book called From Dissertation to Book, written by a man named William Germano. It's a wonderful thing to look at if you are, well, not just converting a dissertation, but if you want to understand something about getting published. But he's put together a little chart where he's comparing what you find in a dissertation and what you find in a book, and it's kind of highlighting the differences between the two of them. So a dissertation starts off as an academic requirement. You do it because you want to get your MA or your PhD, and that's part of what you have to do. Books are put together by people who have something to say. They want to speak broadly. The audience for the dissertation is a PhD committee. The audience for a book, well, he says thousands, but to be perfectly honest, these days for an academic publisher, it usually is not thousands. We find that it's pretty good for a book if we sell 500 copies. But anyway, an audience which is bigger than the 3 or 4 people on the research committee. A dissertation reviews scholarship. A book builds on scholarship. Dissertations very often have a lot of quotations. Books usually have very few quotations. What's going on in a book is that an author is developing his or her own ideas, and they use their own words for that. The dissertation hides the author's voice, and the book creates an author's voice. Now, I'll talk about author's voice in just a minute. But what they're saying here is that when people write dissertations, they usually write in a very dull way. They're just saying, these are the facts, these are what I found. There's nothing wrong with that for the dissertation, but really what you need in a book is some sense of the what would you call it, the personality, the spirit of the author. A dissertation is structured to show off analytical skills, whereas a book is structured around a core idea. And I could say the same thing about an article, that you need a core idea. You've asked a research question, you've answered it, that is your argument. The answer to that argument, or the answer to the question, the development of that argument is the core idea. It runs right through the article or right through the book. And everything you say in it, in that piece of writing, is linked to the core idea. And finally, in a dissertation, you're likely to find a lot of repetitive examples, whereas a book will have selected examples. And these are selected because of their relationship to the core idea. So let me just say something about the author's voice. Dissertations, for a dissertation, the author's voice is usually neutral. You simply report on what you found. But in a book or an article, the voice of the author is important. And the voice is really the way that you say things. So again, let me just go back to something from my own past. When I was thinking about going to graduate school, I hadn't really studied history as an undergraduate, but I was interested in it. But I really didn't have the kind of background that a lot of people did. So there was something called the graduate record exam. And so I thought, okay, I'll take the one for history. What they were doing, one of the questions, or one of the sections actually, was that they gave a quotation. And then they gave you the names of 4 historians. And they said, which of these historians is likely to have been the person who wrote that quotation? And the point that you see in that is that the historians had a distinctive way of saying things. And those quotations that they were asking about were picked because if you knew the field, you would probably be able to guess which historian sounded that way, which historian wrote in that style. So it's the way that you say things. So let's just take, these are not ideal examples, but see, you can say something like, the village had more women than men. Okay, you've established a fact. Or you could say it by saying, in the village I studied, many men worked in the city, so there were more women than men. So in the one, you're communicating more or less the same thing. But in the second case, you're adding something that is sort of the way you're looking at the situation. You're adding this extra bit of information. Likewise, you could say, okay, the village I studied was so many kilometers northwest of Solo. Or you might say the village sat on a fertile patch of land between 2 rocky hills, 9 or however many kilometers northwest of Solo. But in the one case, you're adding some detail. Maybe it's not necessary for the point that you're trying to make, but it becomes something that is your style. Another thing you might be doing is considering certain perspectives. So a lot of dissertations, a lot of writing actually, you're sort of looking down from above and you're saying, okay, I am reporting this, I'm an outsider. But then another way of doing these things is that you try to do it more as an insider. And I mean, maybe you are an insider if you happen to be writing about a place that you came from. But you also, let's say you wanted to find the viewpoint of women in an area about a certain topic. So you've interviewed a lot of women and you stress that. Or you've interviewed a lot of landless laborers or migrants. And so you're looking at a topic from a particular perspective. Well, some people do a lot of this, and they become noted for looking at topics maybe from the ground up rather than from the top down. So again, this is part of what you're doing when you're establishing an author's voice. Whatever it is, what you need to do is take control of the material and write with authority. And again, this is part of the voice that you establish. Generally speaking, when you're doing a piece of writing, you start off and you say, well, I've got this information. So you start putting the information together, and you're kind of hesitating about how you're going to do it. But somewhere in the writing process, you need to step back and basically you're saying to the reader, I understand this. I am an authority on this, and I am now going to tell you. And then you proceed to do that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Pinkani and we can have some questions.
Okay, thank you once again, Paul Kratoska, for the very insightful presentation. I believe everyone agrees with me, as they said in the chat box. Okay, now we will proceed to the question and answer sessions. I will direct the questions to the presenters today, so Paul Nerney and Paul Kratoska, but Linda, if she's still here, and Susan are, of course, more than welcome to join in answering the questions as well. Yeah, so Linda's still here. Okay, so the first question came from Arini Utami. This question came from the first session from Mr. Nerney. So she said, Mr. Nerney, what can you suggest to present and argue for results where the hypothesis is not proven, mostly for quantitative study? Thank you.
Right. Well, it is true that the hypothesis is not proven, but by the time that you're writing the article, I mean, basically the hypothesis should be confirmed or not confirmed as the case may be. So I don't think that situation that you're talking about in the question would actually arise per se. Now, what you may have to do, however, though, if you have an unproven hypothesis and it's potentially contestable, in other words, there are different ways to answer it. You may need to be able to lead your reader in kind of a step-by-step process by which they can see whether the hypothesis holds. In other words, whether it's supported by evidence or not supported by evidence, you know, you would take it from there. So I think that would be the short answer to that question.
Okay, I guess Susan wants to add something.
Apparently so.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. It's interesting that I was just reviewing my notes for my lecture tomorrow, and I think that question may have relevance to a point I'm going to cover tomorrow, which is what I call moderated claims. In other words, when you want to say something, but you're not very sure, 100% sure that what you're saying is correct. Am I making myself clear?
Yes.
You can say it, but you can express uncertainty about what you're saying. And that's what I call a moderated claim. And I'm going to talk about it tomorrow.
And that will be covered tomorrow, right?
Yes.
So
yes,
everyone needs to stay tuned for tomorrow.
Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, just thought I'd pipe in.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Also, Linda. Yeah. Thank you, Susan. Also,
Thank
Linda wants to add something.
This thing. Okay. Yeah, it seems to me that this is also, if you come to that point, if you've done your experiments or collected your data and then it doesn't show what you wanted it to show, it's a good time to start rethinking about how you're analyzing and to see if there's some other approach or some other question that will get at it. I mean, you can write up, yeah, I did this thing and it didn't work, but it's highly unlikely somebody's going to want to publish it quite like that. But my friends in natural science often say that this is the beginning of when you begin to see a new way of looking at a question and coming up with something original. That's it.
Okay, thank you, Linda, for the insight as well. Okay, I guess we're moving on to the next question. Still for Paul Nerney from Lubabun. Hi, Paul. Great talk. You mentioned in the slide that what you mean by the midsection is limited to the discussion section. I wonder if you would recommend us to separate the result and discussion sections. I find it somehow difficult to differentiate between those two sections, and in many times end up with making them together as one single section. Do you have any comment on this?
Yes, I do. In fact, actually, a lot of people do exactly what you've done. In fact, if you look at that introduction argument framework, organization framework I was talking about, that's exactly what happens, where basically the results actually are used as evidence to illustrate reasons that you're giving, which in turn support a claim that you're making. So yeah, I mean, a lot of people do that. Now, traditionally, that's actually what's been done in humanities and humanities and arts, and in some social sciences as well. And you tended to find this in social sciences, where they take a more qualitative approach, or people in life sciences or the physical sciences, they tended to present their findings, just present the findings, and then have a separate in other words, the results section, and then they would have the discussion section, which would then argue, for certain explanations sorry, I'm getting a little tired here.
It's okay.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. But what happens there is that you're there's a lot of repetition that goes on when you have a separate discussion section and a separate results section. And if you're writing a paper of 5,000, 10,000 words, you need to be careful. So what we're finding in the basically in the life sciences and physical sciences, certainly, is a lot of people now are just beginning to combine the two, their findings and their arguments together in the way that I just described. And because they're doing that because, as Paul Kotoska mentioned earlier, that oftentimes the findings themselves, the data is put separately online, so that if people want to check it, they can check it. So you're not really under the pressure that probably we were before of showing your results, because it's in another place anyway. So you don't really actually need to worry about that. So even in the physical and life sciences, we're seeing kind of a shift to kind of where the results and the arguments are mixed together, with the results actually showing up as illustrative evidence of one sort or another. So yeah.
Okay, thank you, Paul. To the third question, came from Nur Haida. This was from the second session about the ethics. If you can rank the unethical practices from the most unethical, how it will be? I guess that goes to Paul Kotoska.
I don't think I'd want to do that. I suppose the most unethical are the ones that involve lying or stealing. But I'm not sure there's any particular value in trying to decide which is worse, because they're all pretty bad. And the thing I think you want to be bearing in mind is that when people do those things, they're really risking their entire career. That's
Okay.
my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. To the next question. Do authors have to inform journal editors how old their data are? If you use unpublished data that are more than a decade old in your paper and you don't inform the journal editors, for example, how ethical or unethical is that practice?
The question really is whether the data are still accurate. Oftentimes after a decade, things have changed. And so almost anything I think is likely to change. And so when you're presenting data, it's often important to say when the data was collected. Now, that doesn't mean it's not publishable, but it could mean that the journal is going to say, well, we need fresher information. Or it might mean they might say, well, it still seems useful to analyze this data. But I think I would be careful with it, I guess the way to put it.
Okay. Thank you again, Paul. To the next question, to Dr. Kratoska. There are two questions from Arini Utami. The first one is, in my understanding, institution where the research ethics are reviewed is the owner of the data. So for example, if a university's institutional review board do the ethical review for a research, then that university is the owner of the data. Is that correct? And the second one, therefore, are we required to invite researchers from the institution who own the data if we are writing a paper with the corresponding data? In my case, this happened after the research project was done, but I found an opportunity for more written results. Thank you.
I don't think there's a single answer to that. Some universities are claiming ownership of data. The National University of Singapore does. And when they introduced this policy, at that point, I was director of the press, and I said, well, there's some problems here. One of the problems is that if I am publishing a book somewhere, the publisher is going to give me a contract, and in that contract, I am expected to say that I own the data. So if the university owns the data, I'm lying in the contract. And they said, well, yes, but the kind of work that you do, nobody cares anyway. So it's all right. You can, we're not ever going to enforce this. We're just interested in things that might be patentable, something that we can make money on. Well, nobody's ever going to make money on what I do. So that was fairly safe. But still, there was a contradiction in that, where they said, we own this. And so it depends on the university policy. And some universities explicitly say, no, we don't. Others don't say anything, and some say, yes, we do. So it sounds like in this case of this question, the university was asserting ownership over the research. Now, whether you have to, if you have written it, you should not have somebody else claiming credit for that. And oftentimes, especially in the sciences, you'll find large numbers of people listed as authors, when in fact they were part of a project, but they might not have had anything to do with the particular piece of research that's being published. But because they're part of the project, I mean, you see articles sometimes with 20 authors, when obviously most of them had nothing to do with that particular article. personally, I think that's wrong, but that doesn't seem to matter much because some universities are insisting on that. I have, in the journal I'm editing now, we've turned down 1 or 2 pieces, partly on the basis that they were saying 15 people wrote it, and it was only a 5-page article, so you can't really accept that. Did that cover everything she asked? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think those 2 questions have been covered. Okay, then we're moving to the next question from Dwi Sloria Suharti. Thank you so much for your outstanding presentations today to both of you. Please allow me to ask questions. I'm Dwi from the University of Education Indonesia. The first one to Dr. Paul Narni. How can I communicate data discovered that is outside of the subject of my research? And the second one to Dr. Paul Kratoska. So self-plagiarism is not permitted. However, it appears that many journals are fine with it. How is it? Maybe we can go to with the first question to Paul Narni.
Okay, so sorry, the question is it's data that's outside her
outside the subject.
Outside the
subject of my research, yeah.
The subject of her research. I think I'd probably say that that's not going to, that data probably would not appear in an article that she was writing about the research project. It might be something, and in fact, I would say always, don't kill the baby, basically, type of thing. You've brought this information into the world and everything. Use it for another paper. That's all. I mean, that would be my first thing. That would be the way I would deal. Don't try to force it into a paper where it doesn't belong, where it doesn't have. It's not particularly related to whatever it is you're talking about. I mean, if the data is somehow compelling, if it raises questions or answers questions that would be of interest to people, but it's not really related to a particular research project, or maybe the article or articles you're writing from that research, then write another paper on it. That would be the best way to handle it, I think. I mean, most straightforward way.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Paul Narni. So we can move on to the second question to Dr. Paul Kratoska.
Well, I'm surprised that she's saying that there are journals that are all right with this, because the self-plagiarism, it's a little bit difficult to say at what point you cross the line. But fundamentally, in an article, you'll have certain information that is background. It's not central to what you're saying in that article. And then you'll have other things that really are what the article is about, the core idea that runs through it. And so self-plagiarism becomes a problem when you're reusing that core idea. And fundamentally what you're doing is double dipping. You're saying, okay, I've published an article about this. Now I'm going to write another article which says more or less the same thing, and I'm going to publish that, and I will get credit twice for doing the same piece of work. It's unethical, and I would be surprised if journals that know somebody is doing that are okay with it.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So the next question came from Anita Trisia. She's saying, what I understand is that in Indonesia, ethical procedures is not really applied in terms of, for example, disclosing information about the respondents is, and I mean, disclosing information about the respondents is okay and considered to be normal. Have you ever found a paper that is being rejected due to disclosing certain information, but when that's actually okay to do to be done in the country, where the writer came from. For
Well,
example.
there's an example in this workshop. Somebody wrote in a question about this, and they had a paper rejected because there was no, it wasn't so much the question of information being exposed, it was that they needed some statement from an ethics committee that what was being done is all right. Now, releasing personal information is fine so long as you have the approval of the person whose information it is. So it's not to say you never do this, but it's more the question of the circumstances under which you do it. And one of the, there are lots of guides, and I would actually urge people to go online and certainly for the US, the American Sociological Association, American Anthropological Association, a lot of these big associations have published guides for ethical research. And it's worthwhile taking a look at those because they signal to you where problems can come up. And we're talking in this workshop about international publication. So it's, I really don't know how this would work out in Indonesia, whether just at what point it becomes improper to release personal information. But the general principle that most of these codes of ethics use is do no harm. In other words, if you release information that harms somebody, then you have almost certainly overstepped.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. We're moving to the next question. Again, Linda and Susan are very welcome to joining us in answering the question. The next question came from Satya from Universitas Diponegoro, Semarang. I am currently working on an article that was sponsored by a certain enterprise, and they wanted to add some of their people as the authors because they contributed financially. Would that be considered unethical?
Well, same thing I answered before. I think that from my point of view, and I'm saying this as a publisher and as an editor, the person or people whose name belongs on an article or book are the people who did the research and did the writing. And somebody who contributed money, you give credit to them, of course, but you don't list them as an author.
Yeah.
And I know you're up against it if they are saying, well, we want to be listed as an author, and I really have no, personally, I think that's not right. But if that's what they're saying, you may have to compromise.
Okay. Thank you, Paul. The next question came from Artanti. When we intend to publish a paper based on the data in our dissertation, some of the data may include quotes from participant interviews and excerpts from interactions among participants. Is it self-plagiarism? How can we avoid plagiarism when publishing based on our own dissertation?
Well, it's not self-plagiarism. The dissertation exists for you to turn it into publications. And generally speaking, the ethical answer here is when you interview somebody, you really should be telling them, I'm doing this for my research. And whatever you tell me, I will use in my research. And so long as that's established, then you should be free to use what information you've been given. With the exception of somebody may tell you something and you realize that what they have told you is harmful, maybe to somebody else. They might have a personal enemy. And so they have told you something about that person that's actually going to hurt that other person. And so you as an author would want to hesitate before you use that piece of information. But it's more a question, I think, of being open and transparent about what you're doing. And I mean, there's some, journalists and some academics, they're dealing with a sensitive topic, and so they kind of get around this by talking about something else and hope that somebody says a few things that are really about the sensitive topic. That's very dubious, but basically you tell people, I'm doing research, this is my topic, this is why I'm asking you this, and the information you give me, I will use. You should be fine. But no, self-plagiarism doesn't come up in that kind of situation. Self-plagiarism is where you've published something and then you use it again.
Yeah. Okay. The next question came from Abdul Hadi. Another question, if you don't mind. How ethical is it if you adapt or modify the original diagram or figure previously published by another author in your proposed paper for publication? The figure looks different, but the content is substantially the same. Many thanks.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very good. If you're reusing part of the content, you're restructuring it and you give credit. I don't think there's a particular problem. But if you're taking somebody else's diagram, reshaping it, and then pretending that it's your diagram, but all the content is theirs, then no, that's not acceptable.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean,
as long as we give
when people do when people do diagrams, they do it for a particular purpose. I mean, they're trying to emphasize something, just the way they put the diagram together. So if you're trying to emphasize something else, you may use the same data, but you're structuring the diagram differently because you're trying to make a different point. I don't think there's a problem with that, but so long as you acknowledge that the content that you're using came from that other person, and that you have restructured it, you've redrawn a map, or you've redone a diagram or a table or something like that. That's done and it's acceptable.
Yeah. Okay. The next question again came from Arini Utami. Question to Dr. Kratoska. What can we do if our names were included in a published journal article without we knowing it? Thank you.
You can cry. You can complain. It probably won't get you anywhere. You can remember it and be cautious in the future. But I mean, why would anyone do this anyway? I don't quite understand. But I mean, obviously, it seems like it's happened. And with predatory journals, this is one of the complaints about them, is that they will take some well-known scholar's name, put that scholar in as an editorial advisor or part of the editorial committee without asking that scholar's permission. And when that scholar writes to the journal and says, take my name off, I don't want any part of this, they ignore it. So the use of somebody's name for something like that they haven't done, that they haven't contributed in any way, is certainly unethical and wrong. Your problem is you really don't have much you can do about it. You can go online, I guess, if you're part of if you have a blog or if you're part of a discussion group, you could say, well, my name turned up on this and I don't know why, because it wasn't me, I didn't do it. But yeah, beyond that, there's not much you can do.
Yeah, except crying, right, Paul?
Well, crying probably isn't going to do much good either, but
you'll feel better anyway, so maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not even sure that happens.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
Okay, then we're moving on to the next. I guess this is more like a response about the predatory journals. In many cases, those predatory journals listed big names in the field as their editors, even without permission. Maybe you have any comments on that?
Well, that's just what I said. They tend to do that. And some big names have they've gone public about this. They said, I was contacted, and this is kind of embarrassing. I didn't know anything about the journal, but I thought, oh yeah, I'll help them out if my name does some good. And so I said yes. And then I discovered what kind of a journal it was, and I didn't want any part of it, but they won't take my name off of it. So sometimes that happens. Sometimes they just pick a name and say, okay, we'll put him there, and that's the end of it. Again, you can't get the name off. So the real point here is they're using those big names to try and legitimize what they're doing. And so as an author, the fact that you see some famous scholar's name listed with a journal doesn't necessarily mean that journal is good. You still have to check it.
Okay. I guess this is going to be our last question for this question and answer session. Came from Zuraida. My question, no, this is the question. If we are targeting the top tier journal, what are the strategies? And we have never published in highly reputable journal. Do we need to pair up with more experienced academic? Do the editor and reviewer see our citations on Google Scholar or other media?
Let's take the second part first. Often articles are reviewed or refereed anonymously. So the referee doesn't know the name of the author of the article. So no, if that's being done, then no, they don't see anything about you online. And teaming up with some big name person is not going to help you either. I got a lesson about big name people early on. I was talking to the editor of a well-known journal, and he said, we get articles from people who are really big names, and they are not good articles, and we reject them. And then they get angry. They say, look, I am big name, and because I'm a big name, you shouldn't be rejecting me. But they said, we reject the article or accept it based on the quality of the article, not the quality of the name of the person who wrote it. And the same thing applies to people who are just starting out. They don't have a reputation. Nobody's ever heard of them. If you can't get published when you're starting out, you're never going to build your name. And in fact, journals like to see young scholars. So this is not going to be a very helpful answer, but the answer about how do you get published is to write a good article. And what we're trying to do in this workshop is help you write good articles. The whole thing I went through yesterday and the whole thing that Paul and Ernie is going through, you start with a good question. You develop an answer to that question, which is your argument, and then you build the article around that. Sometimes, I think there was a question that came through about a rejection where the editor of a journal had said, well, it's not a very good argument. And so if you're told that, I think what you do is you go back to the question you were answering and try to come up with a better question. Paul, do you have anything to kick in on that?
Anything to add?
No, that pretty much, I think pretty much says it all. Yeah, I mean, maybe one thing to think about is, and I think Paul Kwiatkowski makes this point. Actually, he's done so in previous things. I mean, sometimes when you get rejected, I mean, it feels like it's the end of the world. I put so much time and effort into this thing, and then these mean reviewers come along and, say horrible, terrible things about what I've said. And I don't think I'll ever write again. I mean, that's one possible thing to do. But what you can do is if you look at what people say, oftentimes they're offering you maybe somewhat harsh, but they're offering you also very constructive advice as to how you can actually improve the article, which kind of segues into some of the things I've been doing in the 2 lectures that I have given during this workshop, is that I'm basically giving you a meta language so that you can talk about what you've written, but you can also use it to talk to read what other people have said about what you've written. In other words, the reviewers, if you're lucky enough to get peer reviewed, then oftentimes it's very, very helpful, but you need some way of actually interpreting what they're saying so you can turn it around into, and it's not just criticism, but you can turn it around to advice as to how you can actually improve your article, and perhaps send it off to another journal if it's been rejected. Oftentimes, Paul sometimes makes this point as well, that editors themselves will offer advice as well. And if you're so lucky that they would do this, then you should pay attention to it. But you can use some of the things that I was saying, some of the ways of looking at arguments, some of the ways of looking at questions, your topic, your research gap, research answer, and so forth. You can use this to kind of say, well, what is this person really saying about my, for example, research answer here? What seems to be the objection here? And you can then start to repair the paper and come up with something better. Yeah.
Well, let me add something else about top tier journals, because she's asking about strategies for getting published in them. And I think, I mean, there are lots of things that go on in the selection. And one of these things is that sometimes the journal gets a conversation going. And so over a period of time, they'll have several articles that kind of pick up on what was said in an earlier article and develop that. And if you see something like that going on and you can contribute to it, then that's one way of getting published in that journal. But another thing that can happen is that if a journal is covering a very wide range of topics, and I can give you a specific example. The Journal of Asian Studies publishes articles on all of Asia and just about every discipline. And they published an article on something that they rarely do, which is something to do with Korean literature. And the editor said to me, after we did that, we got all kinds of articles on Korean literature. And we're really not that interested in that topic. But because we published the one piece, people thought, oh yeah, there's a place we can go and we're going to get our article published. So just because they've done one article in that, what you need to try and figure out is the pattern of what they're doing. And so if a journal is publishing a lot of theoretical things and your work is not very theoretical, then probably it's not a good place for you to go. If they do a lot of data heavy articles and you're not data heavy, then maybe it's not a very good place to go. But look at what they publish and try to figure out the kind of material that journal is interested in. And the other thing to understand about these first year journals is that they get a lot of material. Most of them are rejecting more than 90% of what comes in. And that means that they're rejecting good articles. They have their choice of a lot of really good material. And something else that you might think about here, every single article that comes in is unique. So a journal editor is not looking at 2 apples and saying which is the best apple. They're looking at an apple and an orange and a banana and saying, well, am I going to publish an article on agriculture, an article on literature? You can't really say that the agriculture article is better than the literature article. It's just they're completely different. And So an editor is weighing some things that you as an author aren't going to know. Like he may feel like, well, we haven't done a literature piece in a while, maybe we'd like to do one. Or maybe this agriculture piece happens to pick up on something that we ran some time ago, or it's very topical. But if you get rejected by one of these top journals, it may not tell you very much, except that they had some other article in mind or something else in mind. Pay close attention to whatever they choose to tell you about why. And if a top journal engages with you, if they come back and they say, well, we got all these reports and they were pretty critical, but we would be willing to receive a revised version. A lot of people take that as a negative. It's actually very, very positive. Again, the Journal of Asian Studies, which is one of these that rejects 90-some% of what comes in, and their managing editor said one time, one of the things that surprised her a lot was that they would send out a revise and resubmit report, which from her point of view was, yes, we're really interested in this. And if you just do what we say or what we're asking, we're likely to accept it. And they would send that out and they would never hear back from the author. Okay, I've said enough about that, I think, but.
Okay. Thank you once again, Paul Nerny and Paul Kratoska, for the answers. And I guess that concludes the second day of the AIFIS-SSRC Academic Writing Workshop. Once again, thank you to Paul Kratoska and Paul Nerny for the very insightful presentation that I believe are very useful for every participant today. Also, thank you to all of the participants who contributed questions to the question and answer session. And before I close the workshop for today, I would like to remind you all that on the first day, yesterday, Megan hinted a little bit about interesting upcoming events from AIFIS that you can join next year. So to keep you updated with the information, you can follow us and subscribe to our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So you can follow us there. And we look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow, where we will hear from Susan Lopez Nerny on topics related to the salient features of publishable academic writing.